was a great thrill when I was first assigned the Blessed Sacrament for me to walk in and see what a beautiful treasure we have here. I've always enjoyed many of the aspects of it. It's such a beautiful church, as we all know, and we've all been very proud of it, and we put a lot of ourselves into it, even physically, in restoring this church. During that restoration process and during my time before that with Monsignor Van, and then even since then, I've come to learn a lot about the church. I've always been something of a fan of architecture before that, and obviously a student of theology, which helped me put a lot of things together right away. But being here during that restoration period helped me to find out some things and to put some pieces together that I really want to pass on to the parish. And so that's my gift then to the parish for all the wonderful things I've been given, is to give this back. There's so much here that has typically, I think, passed on from generation to generation or priest to priest. But at this point, I don't know if that tie will be made, since there's a break from pastor to pastor. There's not another priest here to help carry that on. So I wanted to hand this on as a way of handing on the history and some of the knowledge I've gained about this beautiful church. One of the first things we should note is that it's comes from the motif of Gothic architecture. It's not fully Gothic. Some would call it kind of a neo-Gothic or a neo-Gothic influence, kind of an Americanized version of that. But there are some very Gothic traits to it that help us understand it and understand what this architecture is actually saying to us. It's actually telling us something. Gothic architecture came from a point in time where most people didn't read, and so the faith was handed on really in the language that all humans have, the language of symbolism. And that symbolism was put into the architecture of the great cathedrals and churches so that it showed up in stone and glass. And we see some of that symbolism here. So as I point out some of the architecture, I would like to also give you a little bit of a kind of a symbolic read of what the church is telling us. One of the first things you would notice if you're flying over, when I do the tours for the kids, I always ask them, what would this look like from above? And they always see that it would look like a cross. You can stand here in the crossing and see the main nave here, and then the crossing to the sides, and understand that image of the cross, and what we would call the apse here, kind of at the head of that cross. The interesting thing of this is if we were to take a walk back to the baptismal, there is sort of that same image in the baptismal. We took the original baptismal there as sort of the apse side of it, and then attached a cross to it for a pool to baptize adults. One difference is that this apse has 7 sides for the 7 sacraments. The baptismal has 8 sides because Easter is the 8th day, the resurrection is the 8th day. And so even the symbolism that comes up in the numbers is present all over this church, really. One of the things that influences this church you can see is a little bit of this. Notice the red mosaic in the back. That's a kind of thing that really comes from Sacré-Cœur in Paris. It's a beautiful image that shows the tie-in to some of the architecture around the world. If you were to walk in here and then walk in Sacré-Cœur, you'd think the same guy had something to do with it, or so the architect of our restoration tells me. That really shows us, Sacré-Cœur is only about 20 years older than this church, which kind of shows the development of what we would call strains of Gothic architecture. Some key things to Gothic architecture that we'll point it out to you right away is these arches that we see, like over the Mary altar here, or the Joseph altar, or any of these arches around the back. Notice how the arches come to a point at the top. That says something that we can see in many of the other lines here in the church. Everything's pointing up. You see in the Gothic sense of it, heaven is almost a geographical location. It's not in the mind of the church, but many people sort of saw it that way, and it gives us that sense. Of course, the spiritual sense of our souls being lifted up to God, or being, raising up to God. And that's what all of these lines do. If you notice from the front door looking straight ahead, all the lines of sight bring us right here to the center and then lift us to the top. And without it even drawing our eyes there, we're sort of just lifted in spirit, the sense of being closer to God. The great Gothic churches would always have this very high ceiling to give that sense, and then also to give that kind of angelic quality to the voices, to the sounds, to give that sense of a presence of heaven and earth coming together. One of the things about every church is typically designed around the altar. This is the center point. And this being the Church of the Blessed Sacrament has a special significance to us by name and by worship and by purpose. And the center of our faith being the Eucharist, all the lines come here and even the weight of materials come here. Something I learned during our restoration, we found some of the old tickets on, pretty much what went into this church. And one of the things we found out is that that high altar there, the reredos and the high altar in the back, the original altar, 39,000 pounds of marble. Where other things, we have wood out here and we have terrazzo here, and then really the weight and what would be, kind of considered the principal material is also the principal focus, 39,000 pounds of marble. That is to get our eyes right there where they belong. This is the original baptismal. It was in a little room off the side of the front vestibule here when the church was first built. Kind of that symbolism that the entrance to the church is through baptism. This is our first sacrament. It's the primary sacrament. After a few changes were made in the 70s, the baptismal was up near the front by the St. Joseph altar over there. And during the restoration, we actually moved it back here, the theme being that baptism is the entrance to the church. And then we expanded the baptismal here, as I was saying, with this outline of a cross, which is somewhat of a reflection. If you would see the church from above, here it is here in the sacrament of baptism. And we put it here because every time we come in, we have that habit of making a sign of the cross. It's always a reminder that we're baptized into Christ. The baptismal waters we touch again to remind ourselves of our baptism into Jesus Christ. If we were to stand, if you stand right here and look forward, one of the things we look through as we come in the doors is the baptismal, and then we look right to the main altar. Those lines that draw us to the altar and then lift us up. One of the beautiful things about this is all the focus of this church brings us right there to that center of the faith. And then they lift us to God. It's by design that we're kind of brought into that, and then kind of floating around us is some of the history of our faith. When we look at this church through sacramental eyes and our sacramental imaginations, we kind of begin to see the history of the church and also the sense of heaven and earth coming together. Some things we notice here as we come in is the floor we're walking on, it's green. The seats we sit in, the pews, are brown. They're wood, they're stone. It's the stuff of earth. It's the colors of earth. And even as we begin to go up, especially when you notice in the crossing there, all where the ribbing comes off the top of these columns, the colors begin to get lighter, and the columns begin to get thinner, and it gets more of an ethereal feel to it, more of a heavenly feel. In fact, even as we go up, we begin to see in the art, we begin to see the angels and the saints, having us raise our minds to the things of heaven. It's a beautiful sense, though, because the theology of the church is that during Mass, heaven and earth are together. And really, it's the theology of the church that heaven and earth aren't so far apart anyway. All of this is called to mind when we're here at the Eucharist, and we are really taken outside of space and time and come into this place of being in the sense of God. In our earthly bodies, we still feel very much here, but this church is meant to give that feel that we are together with all of those who have passed on into eternal life, and all of those that are in between them and us, those in purgatory. After all, we do pray for them even in the canon of the Mass. Notice these statues back here. They're a little bit hidden. There's also two statues right outside the door, Joseph and Child and the Sacred Heart of Jesus. These six statues, these four and the two outside, were actually in the Mother's Chapel, which is now our Adoration Chapel. We found these statues in the basement of the church, kind of tucked behind all kinds of things. We didn't even know they were there. And one of the things I like about that is Therese of Lisieux is one of those statues. She's often called the hidden saint because she was in a cloistered convent. She died at about 24. Someone who considered herself very small in the church, but even though from a cloistered life, she actually has been called a doctor because of all she's taught us about the love of God. And here she is, still a little bit hidden, but here nonetheless. When I first stepped in the church with, it was then Father Van, when I found out I was assigned here, he brought me out to tell a couple stories then about the meaning of this church for me. It took on great meaning right away because when I walked in the side door, I was suddenly face to face with Our Lady of Lourdes shrine over there, which was, of course, in the church right at the beginning. When I was up at Mundelein Seminary studying, there was an outdoor version of the Lady of Lourdes, identical to this one indoors. Same statues, same rock formations and everything. And I had made the habit while I was up there of asking Mary for her intercession to help me to be a good priest and to hopefully even make it through seminary. But along the way, that became my habit, that every day I would walk out of the dorm building I was staying in on my way to classes or Mass or wherever I was going, and as I'd be going by, I'd say a few Hail Marys to her, asking her for her intercession and help. I remember the last day I was there, I still did not know where I was going to be. It was only 5 days before ordination. I had no idea my assignment. I stopped and I said, "Mom, I'm going to miss you. I wish there was a way we could stay together." And it was a wonderful thing when I walked in and there she was. So I like to tell students, especially in RCIA and our grade school students, when you've kind of taken on a relationship with a saint, they sort of follow you around. They're like family. And that's all over the place here in the church. The back window is a window kind of to the priesthood. We have Moses and Melchizedek. We have Abraham, Jesus. You can see him holding the host in the center one to the right. And then on the far right down below, we have Pius X. He's holding a host over the chalice. My first day out of philosophy class, my first day of classes, I came out the door and I was walking next to the student, with the student next to me, and I looked over at him and said, "I just don't get this stuff." It was this kind of mind-bending philosophy right out of the gate. When I looked up, across the way in the grassy area, there was a statue of a man doing this. So I thought I'd go find out who it was. It was Pius X. So I thought, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and get to know that. There's just something about that struck me. I wanted to get to know him a little better. So he became a patron of mine through seminary. I kept asking me. He was said to be very studious, hardworking, give good homilies, you know, just one of those guys that I wanted to be like. So I got to know him during seminary, and he kept showing up. My great-grandparents from their estate, there was a picture that they had hanging in their house of Pius X when he was actually Pope. And my parents, somehow it came to them, and while I was in seminary, they didn't know about this yet, but they sent the picture to me. A priest had come across a relic of Pius X, and he sent that to me saying, "Well, you probably need this more than me right now." So Pius X kept showing up. When I got here, my first daily Mass, I stood at the front altar, saying Mass, and at the end of the doxology, you hold the host up over the chalice and elevate that. And I looked up at this window and I saw a priest holding a host over a chalice. I know who that is. And I walked up here to investigate. It's Pius X holding the host over the chalice. So the saints do follow you around. Even more than that, I just sort of felt like I belonged here when I got here, and I was wondering why I might be here a short time. Turns out 9 years was far more than I could have ever hoped for, and very grateful. But in the high altar, there's 3 relics. There's a relic, St. James the Greater, my middle name, St. Barnabas, the saint on my birthday, the feast day of St. Barnabas, and Therese of Lisieux, which is one of 2. She and John Paul II wasn't dead yet, but I read a book by him, and I read Story of a Soul by Therese of Lisieux. These were the 2 books that really finally helped me get over the hump, you might say, to get into seminary. So here they showed up, you know, the namesake, the feast day, and Therese of Lisieux. The deep marble altar on a wooden block was the first altar that was put out in front, away from the high altar, and that was done in the 70s when the church had a few changes made then. We took that out because it didn't really fit with the architecture. Nobody seemed to have any emotional attachment to it at all. And we went with this altar that is in the same shape and style as the altars around it. And out here praying one day, trying to figure out what to put in the front, decided to put this Leonardo's Last Supper there, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. The reason being is when you look at the high altar, you can see several things. It's doing what an altar should do. Up at the top we see Jesus Christ, of course, crucified on the cross. Below that you see a pelican standing on a globe. It's kind of an ancient Christian symbol for Christianity because the ancients used to think that the pelican actually plucked its own breast to feed its young with its own blood, an image of Christ feeding us with his own blood. Then we have below that the 2 cherubs holding a canopy up over where they used to set the monstrance for 40 hours. Below that, the tabernacle where Christ is truly present. Below that, in the mosaic, in the front of that altar, you see the vine and the branches. You see a few symbols. They're the Alpha and the Omega. Christ is the beginning and the end. We see IHS in the center shield, which St. Bernardin of Siena actually popularized that just a couple hundred years ago. It's the first Latin letters for Jesus hominum salvator, Jesus, Savior of humanity. And then we see the vine and the branches, the grapes around it. The vine, the branches, the grapes are the only hint of anything toward the meal aspect of the Eucharist. Everything else is sacrifice. In fact, that altar screams, I am Christ, which an altar is supposed to give us that sense that it is Christ. The altar is another symbol of Christ. Christ is the priest, the lamb, and the altar of sacrifice. As I was saying before, we can see saints and angels kind of all over the place. Back here, holding up those lit up torches are two angels. I love the story of how this happened because these two angels, Monsignor Tarrant, of course, who founded the parish and built the church, was working with the Prado Studios in Chicago. And he was with them to try to work on these angels, and they wanted to do the traditional where they were bowing or kneeling. And what he did was said, no, 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 this is a glorious thing. It's a glorious church. These angels should look like they're, glorious there. And he stood like this, and the artist said, well, hold that pose for a second, and sketched out the pose. And just as kind of a memory that it came from Monsignor Tarrant, the belt you see on the angels there, it's kind of that woven belt. That's his belt. They actually sculpted that into those angels to remind us of Monsignor Tarrant. In fact, the altar is dedicated, or it was donated and dedicated to the parents of Monsignor Tarrant. The children was dedicated, or it was donated by Monsignor Tarrant and his siblings. The angels we find everywhere in here. You can see them again in this seven-sided apse. Notice the seven angels and notice the seven windows. Each one represents a different sacrament. It's subtle. You have to look close to see it. The center one is the sacrament of confirmation. You can see it in the red that the angel is wearing, and also the metal breastplate that we kind of, the former sense of how we would describe that sacrament of being a soldier for Christ. You see the breastplate of faith. He's also holding a candle that looks like a flame. The tongues of the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles in that first Pentecost as tongues of fire. And down in the window, you notice that window is the most red of any of them. And as you go out to the side, they become a little bit more blue. There's a telltale sign in each one of these that tells you which sacrament it is. The one to the left of the center is the Eucharist. He's holding up the lily. The lily is the sign of a just person, or being justified by faith, being brought into the justice of God by receiving the Holy Eucharist. And you can see there in the window the chalice and the host. Okay, the one to the right of center is the sacrament of penance. Notice the angel is wearing that sacramental color, a little pale version of it, of violet. And that's, for penance, and of course, then reconciliation with the Lord. To the right, you see what was at the time kind of a traditional stole where it would come to one piece in the center. And down below that, you see a chalice and host, and then a stole across that over the missal. That is holy orders. To the right of that, on the end, is matrimony. You can see kind of that ring or wreath, that circle there with the two hands, the sign of marriage there. Going back around the other way, go past confirmation and go past the Eucharist. And you see the other one wearing purple, which that one is for the anointing of the sick. You can see him kind of holding the container for the oils there. And down below you see the keys too, because it was often spoken of then as extreme unction or last rites. So those are the keys to the kingdom, by that sacrament entering the kingdom at the point of death or birth into eternal life. And then finally, the farthest one to the left is baptism. You can see kind of water being poured out in the window, and up above wearing the white. Something that's specific to this church and the time this church was built are these two banners up here. Render to God the things that are God's, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Notice too that which side they're on. When Mass was said facing forward, the American flag then would of course have been to the right of the speaker. Since then things have changed, so the flags we have down here in front of the sanctuary are opposite of those flags up there. But the reason that's up there is because this being built in the late 20s, it was that time in the United States where the Catholic Church had gone through really a couple of centuries of not being so much hidden, but a little bit persecuted. They weren't real welcome in this country. And they had become quite a force. We basically built up a large share of the education system and promoted it to become what it is now. A large share of the health system had already been built up by the Catholic Church. They had been very active in civil society and had come to a place of some prominence also in the country, and yet were not really accepted. So the church in the 20s was kind of making a habit. You can see this up at Mundelein, you can see it in our own cathedral, of pretty much trying to hold out there the idea that you can be a good Catholic and a good citizen. These two go hand in hand, and they're meant to. And we put these up, or these were put up here at that time, really to remind us and the world that we belong here, we have a lot to contribute, and we have a lot to be proud of, and we do a lot for the civil society, not just for the spiritual world. So that's what those are there for. While we're up here in the sanctuary, notice the numbers of steps that we have. This one was originally a communion rail, so it kind of didn't count. It was a place where you'd come up and kneel. But it works out pretty good now in my sacramental imagination anyway. There were 3 steps up into the sanctuary. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, the number 3, of course, always speaks of the Trinity, and 3 is a good number for architecture. Odd numbers work out really well that way. But theologically speaking, 3 always calls to mind Trinity, and there are 3s everywhere here. You can look all over the place. Up in this frieze channel that goes around the church, there's 3 little sections in it. You can look at these doors, and you see the Trinity there by kind of a rounded out triangle, and then within that 3 intersecting loops, circles that are kind of flattened out a bit. But 3 intersecting circles and a triangle, those are both symbols for the Trinity. One of my favorite things in here that we found at restoration, I had never noticed it before, was in these lamps. Notice there's 1 chain, and I'm going to translate this as I go. 1 chain, 1 God. We get right here, and there's a link right there that's a 3 intersecting circles kind of a link, the Trinity. And that looks like a crown right there, the crown of Christ the King. Coming from that is 3 chains again. And then they hit a point here, also put together with a 3 intersecting circles link, where it splits into 2. So now we have 3 chains coming together there, and that system of 3s holds up the light, or the system of 3s, we could say symbolically, sheds the light to us all, the light of Christ to all of us. Just little things like that you can read into the architecture and with your sacramental imagination. One thing I should point out is we brought back this sanctuary lamp. It's not the original, but from the pictures we had, it's as close as we could get to the original. We did a search all over the US and Canada and found 3, and this was the one that looked pretty much like ours in the pictures. It's really the one thing that's kind of put back, you might say, that isn't original to the church itself. We were able to tie in some things from the communion rail that used to be here. All we had left were the gates, and these are what's in this rail over here on the side. Another mark of Gothic architecture are these rose windows. It's something that I love to point out when I do tours. When you want to see what the theme of a rose window was, and each one had a theme, you look at the very center to see what's in the hub, and then it radiates out from there like the spokes of a wheel or the petals of a rose. And the center of the theme on this one in the east is the Immaculate Heart of Mary. You can see it in the I and the M. The I on the top has a crown, and in the center of the I where the M crosses is a heart. Radiating out from there are different symbols of titles for Mary, like lower left as you go down from there at what would be about 7:30 on the clock is a rose, or Rose of Sharon is one of her names. That window's dedicated to Mary. It's blue, it's her color. If you look across the way, if we were here earlier in the morning giving this tour, this window would be more blue. This window is the one that changes colors. This time of year, when the sun gets right behind it, it changes it more dramatically. If you look back at the Mary, there's blue with just some red edging in it, and that's about the way this one starts out on the west side, is a little bit darker blue with some red edging on it. This window is dedicated to the Sacred Heart of Christ, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. You can see it by the chi, the P, as we would call it, but the Greek letters chi rho, first letters for Jesus Christ in the Greek. And it has a heart in it as well. Now, as the day goes on, that window turns more and more red. And what I love about that is, well, we know the story that Jesus got his humanity from Mary because he was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit's color is red. So we see Mary and we see humanity and divinity both in that window. I also like, don't know if it's by design or not, that they face each other. And that's something that we know in our theology. They're always looking at each other. Mary is always looking to Christ, always pointing us to Christ. In fact, if I can get you to look at the Pietà over here, this has to be my favorite piece of art in this church. I call it the Pietà. Maybe it was originally called the Sorrowful Mother. I'm not sure if they actually titled it, but it's something like the Pietà that Michelangelo did. If you look at this, if you were to look up close at the faces, you would notice that the face of Mary and Jesus are the same. In fact, they would be identical twins, but for the beard of Jesus. Which it should be. He got his humanity from Mary. He's a reflection of her in humanity, but in him we also see his divinity. And it's kind of a nice way when you put these two windows together and this statue, you begin to see something that the church can never really explain very well, that mystery that Christ is both human and divine fully. And then here, while we're at this shrine, the Sorrowful Mother Shrine, it's dedicated really, this area, as the whole church is, the official name of the church is the Memorial Church of the Blessed Sacrament. It was kind of dedicated as a memorial to all of those who had died. It was in between the two great wars. So we have plaques back here for those who died in World War I and World War II, and the wars, several of the wars since then. It's also a memorial because we have here a place where people, as they die, they put their they put up a plaque over here because they can register in this memorial, and then there will be a mass said for them twice a month, and the kids pray for them, our students pray for them in the school. Just a way to remember all those who have died. Remember, that we have an obligation to pray for them. Something I want to point out when we speak of Monsignor Tarrant and the founding of the parish is to remember that the see for Springfield was moved from Alton in 1924. Monsignor Tarrant was then the Vicar General to Bishop Griffin. And when it was moved here, of course, Monsignor Tarrant came with him, and that was when the Blessed Sacrament, the Parish of the Blessed Sacrament, was established. Monsignor Tarrant then would have been instrumental in the building of the cathedral in 1928. 2 years later, then he undersaw the building of this church. Some things we should realize, even though theologically every church of the diocese is a daughter of the mother church, the cathedral, in a way we're kind of sisters too, because if you look at the tabernacle, it's an exact duplicate of the one that's in the cathedral, and this is the chalice that was presented to our parish that is also the same as the one that the cathedral had for their parish chalice, or their church chalice, upon its dedication. And it was given on the date of the dedication of this church, November 27th, 1930. So even in materials, we even see it in the scagliola, as I said, which was used throughout the cathedral and under its construction. I think Monsignor Tarrant had tried to go a little bit bigger with marble, but it ended up being the same materials. So the churches are very much related, theologically mother-daughter, but in many other ways even as sisters. We have the high altar where we see Mary present at the cross again, Mary and John, in that great scene in the Gospels where the Lord gives Mary to us as our mother and us to Mary as her children, as her sons, specifically with John. And I think it was Fulton J. Sheen that talked about what kind of a trade was that, for her to carry the divine Son in her womb, the one that could not be contained, in her womb. And then, now here as he's given his life for us as a trade, she gets to take us who can't even really fathom what's going on there. But again, next to the rose windows, one of my favorite stories of the Restoration, and I like to use this in funerals and other preaching moments too, are the angels next to the rose windows. I think it was in the 60s, as far as we can tell. The only other time the church was painted between 1930 and 2005 was in around 1964. But at that point they painted these angels. A little bit of some facts we should know when the church was being built, or was about to be built. The history is that they started the campaign, pretty much had that going. Only 250 families to build a church this size that in our dollars today would take somewhere around $25 million to duplicate. But 250 families gave enough to do this. They pledged enough to do this. Then the stock market crashed, and before they had really gotten started on it, they actually scaled the church back. These side naves here, where we have the shrine of Our Lady of Lourdes and of the Sorrowful Mother, were supposed to be side chapels. They scaled those back. We think, I haven't determined that for sure, that they also scaled the length of the church back. And we're pretty sure, according to some of the documents we had, that the sides were going to be granite up to the height of that frieze. Also, we all call this marble. It's not marble. It was originally going to be marble. These columns in here, it's called scagliola. It's about a 500-year-old art. It's marble, dust, and plaster. And they actually mix the color into it to create this scagliola. You see, at the time the church was built, when the stock market had crashed, and here we were in the Depression, those same 250 families were still willing to sacrifice what they did in the Depression to build this church. And at the time, labor was much cheaper than materials. So they could afford the labor to make the scagliola. They couldn't afford to buy the marble. So this is one of the ways they made it work out. And when we did the restoration, the restorers told us they had never seen any place they'd done in the country scagliola in this kind of shape. It had been, there weren't cracks in it. It hadn't shifted. In fact, going back to that rose window up there, what's in between the stained glass is not wood, it's stone. And that's quite a trick if you think about that. If this church had settled probably even a 1/16 of an inch anywhere, that would have all cracked. And I like to sort of, with the wrong connotation, blame Monsignor Tarrant and the angels I was talking about there for sort of holding up the church or making sure that it was built well enough to be held up over time. To get back to those angels, we discovered that they had been painted over to look like scagliola. In the meantime, over 40 years, they'd gotten very dusty. And so much so that they just looked sort of dark and faded away. When we came back into the restoration after we had cleaned up the angels to the original and bronzed their trumpets, when people came in, they accused me of putting those angels up there. So just so you know, I didn't. They were there all the time. But I love that little fact because it points out something about our faith. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. And we know that the angels, the saints, they're all around us all the time. Once in a while we catch a glimpse, you know, like I was talking about the saints that follow us around. Just like in the crossing up here, it's a very traditional thing in this style of church to have the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also 4 doctors of the church. The ones that were chosen here were Ambrose, who was actually a teacher of Augustine, one of the great doctors of the church, St. Gregory the Great Pope, one of the 2 popes we call the Great, and then also St. Jerome, who translated the scriptures into the vernacular of the day, which of that time was Latin. Translated in the Vulgate because, as his famous line is, ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. And so he translated it not into the high intellectual learned Latin, but into the vulgar Latin, the Vulgate. That's how we get that term, because he wanted anybody that could read it all to read Scriptures. I want to point out these paintings in the 4 openings that look like they could be windows to the south side next to the sanctuary here. These are the originals. If you remember, before the restoration, we had different versions. They seem to be in different places. There was a canvas put over these originals, and then copies of the originals was painted on the canvas. So they were in different places. When we were investigating this to clean and restore, we noticed that, and we started to pull the canvas back. We found the originals, and they're in very healthy condition. Really, the only thing we had to touch up was some of the gold on there and a couple of the colors we had to clean up to bring them back out. One of the stories on here, some things we should know about this, is we have you know, St. Dominic being given the rosary by the Blessed Mother. I remember we have the Springfield Dominicans in town. I think that's a nod to them. On the far end, we have St. Ursula. She's carrying, you know, that fern leaf that's a symbol of the victory of the martyrs. Ursula is a saint famous for having died with, as they say, 10,000 young women martyrs. And it was the Ursulines that helped us found this parish by helping us start the school. So that's a nod, a recognition of the Ursulines. Then we have Jesus with the children, again, recognizing the importance of the school, the children to this parish, passing on the faith to them. One that has a great story to it, at least for me in my time. I haven't said this to too many people, so this is kind of maybe a little surprise gift to everybody in the parish, is this picture of Jesus standing at the door knocking. Many in the parish had told me when I got here, the booming voice of Father Cassidy when he would preach, that great booming voice that would go out, didn't even really need a mic. And the homily they all remembered was working off of that picture, which actually used to be on the far section over there. That picture, he said, notice there's no handle on that door. Jesus doesn't force his way in. You have to open the door and let him in. They all remembered that. When we uncovered this picture, the original one here, there was a handle on the door. So that's the one thing I've changed in the whole church from the original as we've seen it here. I noticed that. I went up there on the scaffolding and I noticed that up there, and I told the artist, you have to paint this out. I don't want to wreck the memories of that homily. I hope I'm not doing that now. I thought you would enjoy that little bit of trivia. So the handle that was on that door was a big ring hanging from that latch on the door, has been painted out in honor of Father Cassidy. Every church is required, every church and chapel is required to have a Stations of the Cross. I love these, the way they were redone. The colors blend with the church, but when you look at it, they also give some great depth to the characters in the Stations of the Cross. So they are around the outside. My favorite one to talk about when I'm trying to teach the Stations of the Cross is something that's a little bit of trivia, where the woman comes to Christ and wipes his face with a veil, and we call that the veil of Veronica. Interesting thing is, as the legend, and any time it's ever been researched and we can find out, a legend ends up being truth in the Catholic Church. We end up finding out it really happened. The story goes, or the legend goes, that Veronica, or the veil, by this unknown woman, we didn't know the name of her, was kept, and it was actually hung up on walls, even outside, for 300 years, because it had such a clear image of the face of Christ that people would see that, recognize his image in his own blood, and venerate that image as a way to see the face of Christ. It was called the Vera Icon, which means the true image, and over time it got shortened Vera Icon to Veronica, and that's how she got her name. So Veronica, or the nameless woman who wiped the face of Christ with the veil. Again, a little theology I like to point out. Mary, I don't know how many of us have recognized that in this statue that's on the altar to Mary here. This was one of the side altars where originally priests could say a mass at these side altars. Notice she's standing on the serpent. The serpent has an apple in his mouth. That's to recall to mind that whole beginning in the Garden of Eden, when we were told that the serpent would always snap at her heels, but that he would be crushed. And so here we have Mary standing on the serpent, that apple that was our downfall. We have our salvation came through Mary, as we see her standing on the serpent, but that the son of the woman would crush his heel, or crush the head of the serpent, even though it was always snapping at his heel. Another bit of history for the restoration: this statue of the Sacred Heart is right back where it was originally at when the church was first built. Over time it seems to have migrated. It was expressed by many people that they wanted it back in the original place. So you can see too that it kind of offsets the ambo, and even by design the marble matches, of course, but it's in the same place on this side as the ambo is on that side. We cleaned it up and brought it in. You can see it's a little different color. It got a little roughed up out in the weather, so we had to regrind this to preserve it, but it's the original one, and it's back in its original position. Something I'd like to point out too, just the details in this church, maybe or maybe not you've noticed it. This kind of work here, the scroll work on here is very beautiful, and in architecture like this it never just shows up in one place. It's very much like the little leafy scroll work at the edge of the pews, if you're looking as you go up and down the aisle. Just like the grills over our radiators on the side, the pattern in those grills is picked up in what's painted back here around the back walls of the apse. Something else we should know is, some of the lines in here, I pointed out earlier the mosaic that reminds of Sacré-Cœur in France. Notice how down here they have the mosaic that looks like gold and even a little black there. It sort of gives a symbol of a priest's stole. So a priest's stole at the altar, kind of reminding the Eucharist coming through the priesthood of Jesus Christ. One of my favorite finds of the restoration was right here. There's a spot where there was a little marble box. It was made with this same marble. A little marble box with a mosaic on the front. It had a key slot in it. It was locked. I never could find that. You can almost see the spot here where we took it off the wall. I knew that it was where they had kept the holy oils when baptism was done up here, but we couldn't find the key. Could never get in. We managed to get the box off the wall, and I went in search of a key for it, looking through every key I could find on the property. I finally found a key that opened it. When I looked inside, I thought it would just be empty, or maybe some oil containers or something in there. What I found was a real surprise. I found the documentation for the relics that the church has, and stuck to the bottom in what was left in a residue of oil, I found of holy oil. I found what looked like a relic case, so a reliquary. So I finally got that loose and pulled it up and recognized that it was a relic. It's a relic of the true cross. Finally found a good way to unveil that for the parish this past Good Friday, when had a wooden cross made with the relic fit in it, so that we could actually venerate a piece of the true cross on which the blood of Christ flowed down 2,000 years ago. What's really powerful about that, though, when you think about it, is that blood of Christ is present here every time we're at this altar. The upper windows are pretty much just little symbols that you might find anywhere in Scripture or church history. But there's some of these windows have a special meaning to them. As you go down the windows on the east side, they are saints with special devotions to the Blessed Sacrament. You know, like St. Clare of Assisi is there. You can see holding up the monstrance. She's the one that when Assisi was about to be attacked, she went to, everybody else was running and hiding or wanting to evacuate. She went, got the Blessed Sacrament out of church and went up and stood on the wall. And when they saw that, they turned around and fled. One of the things that has always been an observation I've made, and this puts a real a warmth in my heart, is every year at RCIA we always interview the people, you know, what drew you here? And almost every year someone comes in through RCIA that basically says something like, well, I always knew the church was here, or I just stopped in, and when I came into the church I knew God was here and I knew this was home. It goes right back to what I was saying about all the lines kind of focus us and lift us to the Lord. There's a weight to this place. And even the way the steps are, the way this is kind of delineates the sacred, like a church should do. It marks out that some things in this world, even though it's all created by God and God is present everywhere, some things, some places in this world are set apart as sacred, places where we meet God, where we come into the time and space, if we could say it that way, of God, even though He's outside of time and space. But here is a time and space where we can meet God. The history of the sanctuary lamp, when that was first brought around, was before the time when we kept the Blessed Sacrament in, you know, when we repose the Blessed Sacrament in a tabernacle of any kind. It was actually kept near the sacred chrism. Sacred chrism was seen as almost like we look at the Eucharist as being the body, the true body and blood, the actual body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. So wherever the sacred chrism was kept, there would be a lamp burning. And then finally when we kept the Blessed Sacrament in tabernacles, when we began keeping that after Masses to use for the sick or for viaticum, then we have the sanctuary lamp, which when we see that, you know, as Catholics we know when the sanctuary lamp is burning, Christ is present in the tabernacle. I really credit so many of the good things that have happened in this parish to those people who sacrificed to set up perpetual adoration. We only have it in a few places in the whole diocese. But that's been a gift to this parish, and an appropriate one in the parish that's dedicated to the Blessed Sacrament. What a gift it's been to this parish, and what a gift it's been to me. In fact, this whole church has been the embodiment of God's great gifts to me. It makes me wonder what's coming in the future when so much of what God has given me has been made so clear here, even in the architecture, and even clearer in the love of the people here, this great community. One of the things I've noticed since the day I got here is that there's never a lack for things to preach with in this church. I love preaching here because there's almost always something even in the church that I could use for it. I'm going to miss that gift, but I'll remember it and probably use it. So I'm sure this beautiful church will be remembered in other places in the diocese because of that. But what I wanted to do was give you this gift of something of a tour here, so that the things that I found out or things that have been remembered would not be forgotten. But most of all, from me to you, for all you've given to me, and the great blessings I've received being pastor here, all the way from my assignment as fresh out of seminary. The great many gifts God's given me, the great many gifts He's given me through you. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for that, and I hope that this is a sufficient gift, some kind of thanks for all you've done for me. God bless you.